Hello students, we are going to discuss reproduction in organisms today. So, reproduction like any other phenomena like metabolism, growth, evolution is an important parameter or characteristic of all living organisms. An organism leaves offsprings for continuation of life. Even after death of a particular individual, its offsprings carry the life further. So, what I want to tell you, why reproduction in our course curriculum has occupied most part, or 1/3 of the syllabus is devoted for the reproduction of plants and as well as human beings. As we know, plant reproduction, its understanding has a good bearing or application in agriculture as well as horticulture. If we look at reproduction, understanding reproduction at its basic level helps agricultural scientists in the production of hybrid seeds. Similarly, human reproduction, its understanding at the very basic level or conceptual level helps scientists to produce test tube babies, treat sexually transmitted diseases and so many things. Here I want to focus on the plant reproduction, in particular why plant reproduction is important. So, now there are two types of reproduction. One is asexual reproduction, the second one is sexual reproduction. Asexual means no involvement of sex cells. Sex cells are the gametes, they are haploid cells, they are produced by way of meiosis. So, asexual reproduction does not involve meiosis and fertilization, it involves only a single parent. On the contrary, sexual reproduction involves at least two parents, and the type of division, meiosis and fertilization are involved therein. Asexual reproduction produces genetically identical individuals as it involves mitosis, the type of division, but meiosis is involved in sexual reproduction. And in terms of evolution, meiosis is more advanced than mitosis, and asexual reproduction is very primitive and sexual reproduction is advanced. If we look at the evolutionary ladder or the organisms, lower organisms mostly reproduce asexually, but higher organisms have sexual reproduction and in some cases sexual along with asexual reproduction. And if you see, sexual reproduction creates genetic variation, and in a population you will be getting genetically different individuals, so that they can adapt to the changing environment. So, during the course of evolution, sexual reproduction is adopted by higher organisms. Now, we will be observing that sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction takes place in the same individual, and if we go for a particular plant, then we can understand how a plant is very eager or strong in its affinity to reproduce. If you look at this plant is a monocot plant. It produced the inflorescence in which the flowers were produced, but now the flowers are not seen and the flowers did not produce fruit, but this plant ultimately produced asexual bodies. These are called bulbils. You can see these bulbils are short modified shoots with tremendous roots. They have more of roots. You see how they are trying to reproduce asexually. When sexual reproduction failed, asexual reproduction is ultimately trying to produce new offsprings. So, from this we can say sexual reproduction is better than asexual reproduction and asexual reproduction is better than no reproduction. So, reproducing is very characteristic feature of all organisms. So, whether it is asexual or sexual, but plants, animals, they go on reproducing. Now, we will be looking at the lower organisms, what form of reproduction they adopt. Now, in the picture we can see it is binary fission. Binary means, bi means 2, an organism. Here you can see a bacterium divides just in the middle by producing inward growth of the cell wall, ultimately pinching the cell into 2, and that is your binary fission. And we should keep it in mind that the type of division involved in this binary fission is amitosis, which is a primitive mitosis. So, binary fission creates 2 genetically identical individuals from a single one. Similarly, so many cells go on dividing and producing a population, and in that population all are genetically identical, and we say that is a clone. So, clone is a population of genetically identical individuals produced by a single organism by mitotic cell division and asexual reproduction. Now, binary fission is also seen in unicellular eukaryotes like Tetrahymena. It is a ciliated protozoa and that also divides by binary fission. Next, when we look at other organisms from different kingdoms, here we see the yeasts Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces is a genus, it has several species, and here we see the budding yeast. It reproduces by means of buds, The parent cell at a particular site, the cell wall weakens and the protoplasm protrudes, and the nucleus already divided, one of the nucleus passes on to the new cell and the protoplasm, and cell wall is synthesized around, and the new cell is called the bud. The bud ultimately grows and detaches from the parent cell, and this is the way by which the yeast cells divide by means of budding. Budding is also found in organisms like hydra, animals like hydra. Hydra is very commonly known for its asexual reproduction by means of bud formation, and that is called budding. So, next is sporulation. Spore formation is another means of asexual reproduction. Here we can recall that fungi produce tremendous number of, very high number of spores. Here the Aspergillus is shown in the picture. Aspergillus is a Ascomycetian fungus, sac fungus, and during asexual reproduction the horizontal vegetative hypha throw conidiophores, and the conidiophores bulge at the tip and produces bottle shaped sterigmata, and the sterigma cut off conidia in chain, and the conidia in the outer or in the periphery, they are blown away by the wind, and we can see all the fungi produces lots of asexual spores, lower fungi and higher fungi, especially these Ascomycetian fungi, they produce lot of asexual spores along with sexual spores, but here we have shown asexual spores. Asexual reproduction in higher organisms like plants. Asexual reproduction means from the vegetative parts of the plant, specific bodies go on producing new individuals. Here we see Kalanchoe. a genus which is very similar to, or it is a sister of the Bryophyllum. In Bryophyllum, we are acquainted with Bryophyllum. In the school days, all the students might have experienced Bryophyllum, which we called Amaropoi in Odia. आमे बही भितर ताकु समस्त रखिथिबा एवं किछि दिन भितरे सेडा कोन हुए गजा हो जाए, रूट्स बाहरे एवं ताकु रखिले संगे संगे गच्छ बाहरे. And Kalanchoe is such a plant. This plant I have taken from nature, and you can see this leaf has so many number of notches in its leaf margin, and in the leaf margin in every notch there will be getting a meristem. That meristem gives rise to a plantlet, and this plantlet is called adventitious plantlet, because if plantlet arise other than any part of the embryo, that plantlet is called adventitious plantlet. So, here plantlets arise from the leaf margins of this Kalanchoe. Kalanchoe is called the maternity plant in English, or its literary meaning is mother of thousands. If you look at this plant, it has at least 20 to 30 leaves, and in each leaf around 30 leaves, 30 plantlets. So, if you calculate a single plant in one time give rise to 700 to 800 plantlets. So, that is why it is very pertinent or right to tell this plant as mother of thousands or maternity plant. And if you look at this slide, this is photograph from a rooftop, no just it is fed by rain, and you can see plants of 4 generations, and the plantlets fall off the plant due to programmed cell death. They fall off and settle in the soil or solid surface and survive. So, this Bryophyllum and Kalanchoe, they are the calm plants, and they have tremendous potential for adventitious plantlet production, and this is very well known plant. In the roadside or in the divider, you can see this agave at many places in our town or locality, and you can see this photograph I have taken. This has crossed a wire, electric wire, and you see the height of this inflorescence axis, and this produces flowers. When the flowers, they go on producing the fruits. To assure its reproductive potential, they also produce bulbils. So, agave in Odia it is called Baro Borosia, that means in 12 years or so it goes for flowering, and it goes for sexual reproduction. If it fails, along with that it goes for asexual reproduction, and asexual reproduction by means of bulbil formation. In the diagram in the right, you can see along with fruits, bulbils are also produced in tremendous number, high number. This is to assure its reproductive potential. Here we can see this pineapple. This is the pineapple inflorescence, and we know pineapple is always propagated vegetatively, asexually, and below, just below the pineapple inflorescence, we have so many number of shoots. These shoots will sprout to give rise to new plantlets, the bulbils. So, bulbis we found in agave, we found this pineapple. In the right diagram, you can see the bulbils have grown to larger size, and they fall off the plant and establish. So, pineapple also propagates asexually by means of bulbil formation, and this Dioscorea in Odia, that is called Khambadu. You can see these bulbils, the reproductive shoots, asexual reproductive shoots are formed, and that also germinates to for propagation in nature. That is the natural means of asexual reproduction in these plants. So, here to the end I want to sum up that this plant we have seen in the florist shop. Here it is your gladiolus. This gladiolus the stem is corm, and the corm produces so many mini corms called cormels. From one corm, many number of cormels are produced, and these cormels are detached from the main one, and ultimately they give rise to new plants. So, horticulturists for this purpose distribute these cormels to the farmers for cultivation of gladiolus in their field. Once botanists have understood the reproduction, asexual reproduction very well, they have exploited different plants for commercial benefit of ours. So, let us look at this. This one is a cutting process. Cutting is a means for propagation of certain plants. In this slide, you can see that stem cuttings of guava is stem cutting having few buds is put in soil having some rooting medium, and usually horticulturists they give root gene which is an auxin for production of more number of roots. So, rooting once in these shoots, roots are induced, these plants establish. So, what is the advantage of this? Now, from a single plant you can produce large number of plants by stem cutting, and advantage of this is all these plants are genetically identical, and we are sure all the plants are genetically identical to the parent plant from which they are collected, no question of variation. So, with a certainty horticulturist can give these plants to the farmers for propagation and cultivation. So, stem cutting is practiced in this guava, chrysanthemum and many other flower plants for horticulture purpose. So, next is grafting. Grafting is a technique in which a stem portion having few buds is selected from a flowering plant of our interest, and it is grafted to a rootstock or a plant which is rooted to the soil or to a container. Now, we can see that the grafting is practiced in two well known plants, one is mango, the other one is cashew nut. Almost in all places people go for grafting in these two plants. So, let us look at how this grafting occurs in the gardens or how people do grafting. So, for that they take a plant which is usually a desi plant or local variety. Usually in case of mango, the local plants or desi plants they have high resistance to disease. So, that is why horticulturists select the rootstock plant is a desi plant, and the plant which is grafted, that is usually called scion, that is from a desired variety. So, for that reason they take the plant rootstock, make a V shaped cutting, and the scion also you can see the scion is also cut in a wedged manner complementary to the V shape of the rootstock, and they are joined and wrapped with certain fungicide not to have infection. And once because of the growth that is the rootstock is established with the scion, then the plant becomes continuous, and we can see the beginning and the end. The photo in the right showing a small plant which is a grafted plant and that has flowered, but can you say any mango plant just starting from its seed grown for 1 year can give rise to flowers? No, question does not arise. A mango plant from a seed it will grow, germinate, grow and ultimately give rise to a plant for about 10 to 12 years it go for flowering. but in these grafted plants there is no need for waiting for 10 to 12 years for the plants to flower. So, the advantage of this kind of grafting in mango is that farmers do not wait for long years for vegetative propagation, vegetative growth of these plants. Rather, within 2 to 3 years they go for harvesting their first harvest from these plants, and genetic identity is maintained in this. Crown grafting is also practiced in case of cacti. In case of cactus, a different color crown is put on the stalk. So, this crown grafting is helpful for cactus, and cacti are kept in gardens for aesthetic purpose. And towards the end of this discussion, I want to impress that tissue culture is one of the important methods of growing plants or generating plants in large number. So, tissue culture is a technique that came into being in 1960 by development of tissue culture medium by Murasig and Skoog in UK. They developed tissue culture medium and the methodology in which very small amount of tissue from the plant, may it be meristem, may it be the leaf, it is taken and sterilized, kept in the nutrient agar medium in the laboratory conditions and maintained at 25 degrees centigrade. Important thing is that when this explant is taken and kept in the tissue culture medium, they go on dividing, they go on producing shoots. So, proliferation of shoots or formation of shoots takes place in the first step, and these are subcultured for propagation. So, from tube to tube they are grown. Here you can see banana tissue culture is under practice since long. Here from the rhizome the meristem is taken and placed in the agar nutrient medium. In the second photo we can see that induction of shoot meristems, and these meristems are subcultured in the third photo and again they proliferate, and in the fourth one a complete shoot is established, and these shoots are separated and subsequently put in mediums containing rooting hormone called auxin. So, auxin induces root production in these shoots. So, shoots with complete roots are subsequently transferred to new medium, and ultimately when these plantlets are complete in their growth, they are ultimately transferred to the poly house or net house for acclimatization. Thing is, the in vitro or laboratory production of tissue culture plants, they do not have well developed epidermis, they are not acclimatized to dry conditions. So, these plantlets are transferred to the net house where humidity is high and sunlight is dim. That is why they adjust themselves, synthesize their epidermis, get cuticularized and become ready for transfer to the fields. So, in this way micro propagation has become an important technique for production of plants, and this has a tremendous potential in tissue culture industry, and this is practiced in banana, papaya and so many plants. So, now I want to summarize this reproduction in organisms by giving an impression that reproduction is a prolific feature of all organisms. Asexual reproduction is usually a phenomenon in lower organisms. Higher organisms have adopted sexual reproductions, but asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction also takes place in the same individual. It is not confined to any particular individual that it will carry on asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. So, they go side by side in certain plants, and certain plants are purely carry out sexual reproduction. Now, these reproduction, when it is well understood, they are commercially exploited by horticulturists. Now, the exploitation of different plant reproduction processes like your grafting or micropropagation has been a commercial endeavor in our community. Now, this horticultural plant revolution, which is called golden revolution, towards the end of this 20th century, that has picked up. So, reproduction is an important phenomenon for plants. Today we are going to discuss an important chapter of plant biology, that is reproduction. From the first year we know like growth, metabolism, evolution. Reproduction is also an important phenomenon of all living organisms. What do we mean by reproduction? Reproduction is a process of living offsprings for the future generations, by way of which an organism lives in future generations. Even the parent dies or an individual dies, its life is perpetuated in its offspring. So, living offspring or giving rise to new individuals of one's own kind is reproduction. So, reproduction is a very strong tendency of all living individuals. Let us go for a plant which is a monocot plant. I think you students can understand identify this plant, at least whether it is a monocot or a dicot. From parallel venation you can judge this is a monocot plant. Why I have this plant before you? Because you can see the flowers here, but these flowers do not give rise to fruits and seeds. Instead, when this plant fails to produce seeds, then an alternative way is production of these kinds of reproductive structures called bulbils. So, these are the reproductive asexual reproductive bodies in this plant chlorophytum. This is a monocot plant. So, now what I want to impress you, that this plant primarily produces flowers, produce fruits, but in this case it fails just like hibiscus or mandar. In that flower production is there, but it does not give rise to fruits. Similarly, this plant produces flowers, but fails to produce fruits, seeds. So, ultimately at any cost this plant tries to produce of its own kind, that is by multicellular bodies, asexual bodies called bulbils. So, from this I want to make you understand that whether it is sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction, whatever the means, the plants or all organisms try to reproduce. So, reproduction is a strong tendency among all individuals. So, then we will be coming to what are the different types of reproduction. Generally, from the school level we know there are two kinds of reproduction, one is asexual, the other one is sexual. Asexual, literally it means means without sex, that means sex cells. So, asexual reproduction is a kind of reproduction in which there is no formation of sex cells, and more important, in asexual reproduction only one kind of parent is involved. So, it is a uniparental reproduction, no question of flower or meiosis or fertilization. So, asexual reproduction does not involve flower, meiosis and fertilization, rather it involves mitosis, is the kind of division in production of different kinds of asexual reproductive bodies. So, only vegetative parts are involved in asexual reproduction. So, let us have a look at this plant. You might have come across bryophyllum, in Odia that we called Amaropoi. At the school level, definitely we might have experienced putting these leaves, Amaropoi leaves or bryophyllum leaves in the books. After few days, that gives profuse roots. So, that leaf is meant for reproduction. Here this plant is Kalanchoe, a close relative of bryophyllum. Here the Kalanchoe in English is called maternity plant or simply mother of thousands. So, now this leaf has in its margin many notches. In each notch there is a bit of meristematic tissue, and from this meristematic tissue adventitious plantlets. I have experimented with this plant. I want to say I uprooted this plant from one location and kept it in my house for 3 days, but after that I found from each notch a plantlet comes, and that is an adventitious plantlets. Why it is adventitious? Because when a plantlet or seedling comes from the embryo itself in the seed, that is called primary plantlet, but plantlet coming out of any other organ, any other part than embryo, it is called adventitious plantlets. So, ultimately a leaf you can see it is having true plantlets in each leaf around 30, and if you see a plant around 5 to 600 plantlets come, and ultimately they fall off this parent plant and establish with their roots in the soil, thereby perpetuating their life. So, that is why it is pertinent or appropriate to tell this plant as maternity plant. So, what I mean to say, even though we do not have much in our syllabus regarding this asexual reproduction, but plants go for asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction, and some plants opt for both. Ultimately, this asexual reproduction is exploited by agriculturist and horticulturist for many purposes. In the beginning I told you asexual reproduction produces genetically identical individuals. If we have got a desired plant and we want to have these characteristics in that plant, we do not want to lose, because in sexual reproduction we will see as it causes variation, the desired set of characters may be lost. So, that is why asexual reproduction is preferred in many cases for vegetative propagation. So, that asexual reproduction, grafting is a kind of asexual reproduction or vegetative propagation in plants. I want to give you an example of Amrapali mango, which is a short variety mango. We are acquainted with this mango. This is a short plant with very good pulp, and its carotene content is around 2 to 3 times higher than any other mango. So, many desired characters are retained in this. So, horticulturists do not want to lose this. So, that is why they go for grafting as a means of propagation of these plants. So, vegetative propagation is widely used, commercially used for propagation of plants like guava, mango, cashew nut, lemon and chrysanthemum, ultimately which is a garden plant. So, one disadvantage of this asexual reproduction I can say, as they are genetically identical to the parent and among themselves. So, no new character can be generated in this. So, they are just as fit as their parents, they cannot have wider adaptability like sexually reproducing plants. So, now let us have a discussion what sexual reproduction is. Sexual reproduction involves sex cells, the gametes, and we know gametes are haploid. In sexual reproduction there are two events involved. one is meiosis, another is fertilization, and the number of individuals involved more than one. At the end we can see in case of angiosperms at least 3 individuals are involved in sexual reproduction. So, sexual reproduction is more advanced than asexual reproduction. In our syllabus it is mentioned sexual reproduction in flowering plants, sexual reproduction in angiosperms. Many students might not be accurately knowing what exactly angiosperms is. Angion literally it mean in Greek term it mean it is a vessel. What a vessel mean? In this diagram you can look at, there is a pea pod, it is open. Now, the seeds are enclosed by an ovary wall. On the right you can see there is a cycas plant which is a gymnosperm. Cycas in Odia it is called Odosimary, but the seeds, the green color seeds, they are directly exposed to the environment, whereas in the pea pod the seeds are enclosed by the ovary wall. So, the ovary wall along with these seeds turn into fruit. So, angiosperms are flowering plants, fruit forming plants, they are much important in our agriculture. It is known that out of 500 plants used in agriculture, around 95% plants are from angiosperms. So, angiosperms they have reached at the peak of evolution. Why? Because angiosperms form fruit, angiosperms within the fruit they form seed, but gymnosperms they form seed, no fruits. So, the advantage of fruit in certain cases we can imagine. We have seen mangoes. Mango, the seed is itself, in Odia it is called koili, the soft part, the hard part, the stone along with the pulp and the epidermis, the covering, total the pericarp constitute the fruit. Are we interested more in the pulp part, the fruit part or the seed part? Definitely none will carry mango from a distance to this place only for the seed. Seed is not important therein for human purpose, it is for the plant, but we are interested more in the fruit part, but in others we are interested in seed part. If we see papaya, we are interested or we carry, we propagate, we cultivate papaya only because of the fruit part, the fleshy part, but not for the seeds, but seeds are essential for propagation. Similarly, cereals, pulses and even coconut. In coconut the edible part is your endosperm, we eat that. So, may it be the fleshy part or the liquid part, that is the endosperm and we are concerned about. But this fruit wall, the mesocarp is used for some fiber purposes, but edible purposes this seed part is important. So, somewhere seeds are important, somewhere the fruit parts, ovary parts are important, but it is the angiosperm fruits as a whole. So, angiosperms because of formation of fruits, they have been widely distributed throughout the globe and that is why they have got an evolutionary success over angiosperms. So, now before explaining the plant's life cycle, angiosperm life cycle, which is a little bit complex, let me tell you the human life cycle, how human beings go for reproduction, because we are human beings, we are acquainted with that. Now, I can say humans are dioecious, they are male and they are females. So, both human males and females are diploid. In their sex organs, they have diploid cells and these diploid cells in male they are spermatocytes, in female they are oocytes, they go for meiotic division and ultimately sperms and eggs are produced in the males and females respectively. What I mean to say, the diploids on meiosis in specific sex organs undergo meiosis producing the sex cells. These are haploid and their fate is to undergo fertilization. If they fail to fertilize, their fate is death. They do not live for a long life. Okay. And these on fertilization give rise to zygote, and fertilization reduces the chromosome number, and fertilization restores the chromosome number to the diploid set, and this zygote again divides mitotically following growth and differentiation, giving rise to the diploid individual. I gave an impression regarding the human reproductive aspect, how the males and females they gave rise to the haploid sex cells. On the contrary, angiosperm life cycle is more complex. The angiosperms we see around us in the nature, the flowering plants we see around us in the nature, they are the sporophytes. They are the plants, true plants having root, stem and leaf, and ultimately they produce flowers. These flowers are the sex organs of the sporophytes. So, these plants we see, the angiosperm plants we see are the sporophytes, because they produce spores. What are these spores? We have seen the pollens. The pollens are developed microspores, but we have not seen the megaspore. The megaspores are present deep in the ovarian cavity within the ovule. They are formed within the ovule, that will come later, but I want to say that angiosperm life cycle consists of two phases. One is sporophytic phase, which is diploid, and this in turn by way of meiosis and subsequent growth give rise to a less prominent gametophytic phase. Then this gametophytic phase again during the course of development, the sperms and eggs present on the gametophytes, they fuse forming the zygote, and subsequently they give rise to the seed and a new plant, thereby completing the life cycle of angiosperms. So, angiosperms have two important phases, one is sporophytic phase, the other one is gametophytic phase. So, sporophytic phase is diploid and gametophytic phase is haploid. Now, students, please look at this diagram. This is a diagrammatic representation of a typical angiospermic plant. You see, the first rooted plant is a sporophyte and it produces the sex organ, that is the flower. In the flower, we know there are two types of essential structures, they are the stamens and carpels. Besides stamens and carpels, we see there are sepals and petals. Sepals and petals directly do not take part in reproduction, rather the stamens and carpels they take part in reproduction. So, stamens by way of meiosis releases spores, microspores, which grow and become the pollens, and we have experienced the pollens in nature, but in the female reproductive part, that is the carpel, we find a basal bulbous structure, that is ovary, which houses one or more ovules in it, and the ovule in its center by way of meiosis produces a megaspore. That megaspore further differentiate, growth and differentiate to form the female gametophyte, which we have heard that is your embryo sac. So, the female gametophyte or the embryo sac has one egg, the pollen in it has the sperms, and we are acquainted with the term fertilization. Pollen lands on the stigma and then sends a pollen tube, and the sperms ultimately fertilize the egg, resulting in a diploid zygote. So, I want to tell you here the haploid fast haploid cells are the microspores and megaspores. Microspores and megaspores do not directly take part in fertilization as it is in case of animals. In animals, meiotic products are directly involved in reproduction, that is I mean fertilization, whereas in plants both kinds of spores, the larger microspore and smaller microspore, larger megaspore, they undergo mitotic division resulting in small less prominent microgametophyte and megagametophyte, in which gametes are present. In pollens there are sperms, in embryo sac there is egg. So, ultimately they go for fusion resulting in a zygote. So, in plants there is a gametophytic phase. The male gametophyte leaves, as we see we have seen the pollens are released, shed off from the plant, and either they are carried by wind or insects, but ultimately lands on a stigma. But the female gametophyte is retained, it does not leave the parent plant, it remains in the sporophyte, and it is necessary, because when the female gametophyte is retained in the parent sporophyte within the ovule, within the ovary, that ultimately leads to formation of seed after fertilization. So, which is a necessity for the formation of seed, and as it is housed within the ovary, ovary after fertilization leads to formation of fruit. So, seed formation, fruit formation is one important feature of angiosperm life cycle. So, now I want to tell you people like this: plants have a prominent long duration sporophyte, we are acquainted with, less prominent inconspicuous male gametophyte, female gametophyte, which constitute the gametophytic phase, haploid phase. So, sporophytic phase is diploid phase, gametophytic phase is haploid phase, but they alternate with each other, completing the process of angiosperm life cycle. So, you could know what is the major difference between the haploid sex cell in animals and haploid cells in case of, or spores in case of plants. Haploid spores go for another generation, they live a life, they are another generation, they are very different from the sporophyte. So, that is why as the life cycle consists of a diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophytic phase, and we can see there may be one sporophyte, but two gametophytes. So, at least 3 plants, one sporophyte and 2 gametophytes, that is 3 plants involved in the life cycle of an angiosperm. So, the difference between the spores and gametes are huge. Spores lead to another phase of the plant's life cycle, and at the end I must tell you that plants exhibit an heteromorphic alternation of a generation, sporophyte and gametophyte, they alternate with each other, and that too sporophytes produce 2 kinds of spores, micro and mega, that is why sporophytes are heterosporous. In the gametophytes, a small 2 small sperms and 1 large egg are involved in fertilization. So, that is why plant reproduction is oogamous type. So, at the end I must tell you reproduction is a strong tendency of all individuals, starting from lower organisms to higher organisms. Lower organisms go by mostly asexual reproduction, and then came sexual reproduction, and our angiosperms prefer sexual reproduction, but still many angiosperms carry out asexual reproduction because they fail. In certain cases stem cuttings are very important. We have seen this China rose, there it flowers, very good flowers, but does not bear fruits, seeds. So, that is why it is vegetatively propagated. Potato is vegetative propagated. So, next is our sexual reproduction is more evolutionarily more advanced than asexual reproduction, as it produces genetically variant individuals. All organisms have a strong tendency for reproduction. Lower organisms mostly carry out asexual reproduction, but higher organisms they have evolved sexual reproduction. So, angiosperms they go for mostly sexual reproduction, but in certain cases asexual reproduction is retained. So, both types of reproduction are important to the plants. So, now asexual reproduction produces genetically identical individuals. So, that is why it is commercially used by horticulturists for propagation of mango, cashew nut, guava and so many plants. And sexual reproduction produces genetically identical individuals, and it makes the plants evolutionarily more fit. And towards the angiosperm life cycle, I want to tell you it consists of a conspicuous prominent diploid sporophytic phase, which on meiosis yields a spore phase, and the spores on germination give rise to the gametophytes, and gametophytes produce the gametes which fertilize or fuse to form zygote and subsequently the diploid zygote. And angiosperm exhibit heterospory, that means they produce two different kind of spores. In anthers they produce microspores, in ovule they produce megaspore, and further they have two distinct phases. So, that is why they exhibit heteromorphic alternation of generation, and oogamy is seen in case of angiosperms, because the two types of gametes, that is sperms and eggs, they are very different in size. So, that is why angiosperms exhibit oogamous type of reproduction. Thank you viewers, thank you all.